In the early 1940s, as the Luftwaffe pounded British cities night after night, the Royal Air Force faced an urgent question: how to strike back harder, faster, and deeper into enemy territory. The question was not born in the sterile silence of a Whitehall office, it was hammered out in the smoking wreckage of Coventry, whispered in the damp silence of London tube stations used as shelters, and screamed by the sirens that wailed across the island like the chorus of a Greek tragedy. This was 1940, and the British people were learning a terrifying new physics: that air superiority was not a shield, but a momentary advantage, and that the only true defense lay in a devastating counterpunch. The Battle of Britain had been won, a victory forged in the smoke trails of the Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, but the strategic initiative remained firmly in the hands of the Führer. The Hurricanes, the saviors of the summer skies, could not carry the fight across the Channel. The Spitfires, symbols of national defiance, could only guard the periphery. The responsibility for retaliation, for taking the war to the enemy's industrial heartlands, fell squarely upon Bomber Command. But Bomber Command was bleeding. The official communiques spoke of brave raids and successful strikes against German infrastructure. The reality, known only to those who waited in the cold morning light for the returning crews, was a sickening cascade of loss. The great hopes placed in the twin-engined Wellingtons, Whitleys, and Hamptons were dissolving in the freezing night air over the Ruhr. These aircraft were rugged, dependable machines, but they were relics of a peacetime doctrine, designed for limited, daytime engagement against poorly defended targets. They were too slow. They flew too low. Their defensive armament was often inadequate. Above all, they were utterly dependent on celestial navigation in an environment where cloud cover was the norm and German radar, the invisible eye of the Kammhuber line, was growing ever more sophisticated. The losses in 1940 and 1941 were reaching unsustainable, morally crippling levels. 50, 60, sometimes 70 aircraft in a single night. A bomber crew had an actuarial life expectancy measured in weeks. The cost was paid not just in airframes and petrol, but in the spirit of the young men who flew them, watching their comrades disappear into the darkness, swallowed by flak bursts or the deadly streams of cannon fire from a lurking Messerschmitt Bf. It was a grim calculus. Hundreds of raids yielded only a handful of verifiable hits. The vast majority of bombs, released into the black void by terrified, lost navigators, fell harmlessly into open fields, forests, or the vast, unpopulated expanse of the North Sea. The enemy's industry continued to churn out U-boats, tanks, and the very bombers that continued to devastate British ports. The strategic bombing campaign, the great hope for bringing the Nazi war machine to its knees, was failing. A fundamental realization began to grip the most visionary minds within the Air Ministry: they were fighting the future with the past. They needed an aircraft that didn't just marginally improve upon the current fleet. They needed a weapon that could render the entire German air defense system obsolete the moment it took to the skies. The call for something revolutionary did not come from a political speech or a general directive. It emerged from a quiet, almost despairing analysis conducted in a windowless room deep beneath the Air Ministry, a room affectionately, if ironically, nicknamed the Crypt by its occupants. The man who chaired this analysis was Air Vice Marshal Julian Calthorpe, a veteran pilot who had hung up his flying gloves to become the head of the Directorate of Advanced Air Strategy. Calthorpe was weary of incrementalism. He refused to debate the merits of adding a fifth machine gun or slightly increasing the wingspan of the Halifax. He had seen enough burnt metal to know that small changes led only to smaller, slower funerals. The Germans are building a wall, he told his small, trusted committee one frost-rimmed morning in late 1940. They are building it of radar, night fighters, and heavy flak. If we give them another 2 years, that wall will be impenetrable. We cannot chip away at the mortar. We must build a machine that flies over the wall. This was the genesis of the project. A directive, scrawled on a single sheet of paper, was passed up the chain of command, bypassing dozens of bureaucratic layers and signed off only by the chiefs of staff and the Prime Minister himself. Requirement: achieve inviolability. Method: total rejection of conventional design parameters. Result: a strategic hammer. The project was not even given a typical Air Ministry specification number, like the B-140th or the P-1336. It was simply given a code name known only to 3 men: Project Chimera. The last point was the most shocking. Every British bomber was a porcupine of machine guns, bristling with turrets. Thorne insisted on stripping every ounce of defensive weight, arguing that carrying guns to fight the enemy was an admission of design failure. "If we are seen, we are lost," he stated simply. "We must be invisible to speed and altitude, not bulletproof." This was the design philosophy that defied every rule of aircraft design, a bomber that was essentially a high-altitude, long-range, minimally armed fighter carrying a massive bomb, built from metal that did not yet exist, and powered by engines that were still prone to catastrophic failure. Its name was never meant to appear in public records. Only a handful of people even knew it existed. The greatest challenge facing Project Chimera wasn't aerodynamic or metallurgical, it was logistical, secrecy. In a war-torn country where every factory was a potential target, every airbase was a beehive of activity, and every scrap of metal was accounted for, how do you hide the construction of the largest, most technologically sensitive artifact ever conceived by the British military? The answer lay in a remote, forgotten corner of England, a dilapidated aircraft repair depot near the town of Little Marston, tucked away in a deep valley miles from any major railway line. The site was chosen not for its convenience, but for its inconvenience. It was a logistical nightmare. Poor roads, sporadic electricity, and constant fog that discouraged aerial observation. The site was officially designated as Air Ministry Storage and Experimental Unit No. 42, ASEU-42, a bureaucratic blanket term that implied mundane repair work on obsolete aircraft like the Battle and the Blenheim. This was the first layer of deception, a double bluff of tedious paperwork. The inner sanctum was a cluster of 3 enormous, interconnected Nissen huts built during the Great War and since forgotten. They were reinforced with concrete, shielded by earthen ramparts, and heated by primitive coal stoves that constantly belched smoke into the valley fog, smoke that was both a visible deterrent and a metaphor for the clandestine work beneath it. Access to ASEU-42 was controlled by a complex system of colored passes. Red pass holders, the highest tier, including Thorne, Vance, and Finch, were the only individuals who knew the aircraft was a bomber. They saw the full plan. Blue pass holders were the construction teams and engineers, told only that they were building a high-altitude meteorological research platform. They were deliberately kept in the dark about the bomb bay and the operational purpose. Green pass holders were the guards, cooks, and support staff, instructed to speak about nothing more exciting than boiler maintenance. The security protocol was draconian. No names. On site, everyone was referred to by their academic title: doctor, professor, engineer, or their 2-letter code AV, PF, GH. The metal lie, the revolutionary alloy Dr. Vance developed, critical for the airframe's unprecedented lightness, was delivered from the smelters disguised as raw stock for naval mine casings, a project so dull and bureaucratic that no spy would ever pursue it. The true composition was guarded with the lives of the half-dozen men who mixed it. The engine gambit. Professor Finch's early prototypes of the jet engine, loud, temperamental beasts that spit fire and shrieked like banshees, could not be tested near any population center. A special, deep-cut quarry miles away was repurposed as a test cell, with its noise baffled by bales of straw and the timing of tests restricted to the middle of the night, scheduled to coincide with German reconnaissance flyovers to be masked by heavy anti-aircraft fire. The noise, if heard, was attributed to experimental tank engine testing. The initial design review for Project Chimera, held in a small, damp office with a single flickering gas lamp, was less an engineering meeting and more a philosophical debate. The fuselage. A tear in the air. Thorne rejected the cylindrical, high-drag fuselage of contemporary bombers. His mathematical models screamed for a shape that minimized the boundary layer effect, a smooth, continuous form designed to let the air pass over it as if it wasn't there. Hemlock's resulting design was radical, a long, slender ellipse in cross-section, tapering aggressively at both the nose and tail, a shape that resembled a polished, enormous silver torpedo more than an aircraft. The bomb bay, instead of being a deep well cutting into the fuselage structure, was integrated into the lower curve, designed to release bombs at high speed without disrupting the laminar flow. The skin of the aircraft, which Dr. Vance's new alloy allowed to be paper-thin yet immensely strong, was not riveted. Rivets, those tiny, proud imperfections on every aircraft of the era, were aerodynamic poison to Thorne. Instead, the panels were chemically bonded and polished to a mirror sheen, creating an unbroken surface, a technical nightmare for production, but essential for the required speed. The wing, The slender dagger. The wing was the aircraft's defining feature. To reach 40,000 feet and stay there with efficiency, the wing needed an enormous aspect ratio. It had to be long and narrow, like the wings of a glider. But to handle 400 miles per hour plus cruising speeds, it also needed strength and rigidity that defied its slender form. Thorne and Hemlock devised a revolutionary, torsion box, structure that spanned almost the entire wing. The alloy used by Vance allowed the wing spars to be hollowed out and reinforced with a unique internal honeycomb structure. The result was a wing of exceptional span, designed to slice through the thin upper atmosphere, and immense strength, but so thin that the engineers had to invent completely new methods of housing the fuel tanks, fuel being the second biggest challenge after the airframe itself. The fuel crisis. Carrying the ocean. A 4,000-mile range required a staggering amount of fuel, not just volume, but weight. Standard aviation fuel was heavy and viscous. Finch calculated that the Chimera would need nearly a quarter of its total weight to be dedicated to fuel, and that the only way to carry it without destroying the wing structure was to use the wing itself as the tank. The solution was the wet wing, a concept then only theoretical. The entire internal structure of the wing, the torsion box itself, was sealed with a newly developed flexible rubberized compound, turning the wing into a massive, integrated fuel bladder. This saved the weight of dedicated fuel tanks, but it meant that every stress, every minute leak, every tiny imperfection in the wing structure was now a life-threatening risk. The fuel, under pressure, acted like a constant, insidious threat to the aircraft's structural integrity. The power plant. The shriek of the future. The jets. This was Professor Finch's domain, and the key to the entire equation. The conventional wisdom held that jet engines, though capable of high speed, consumed fuel at such a rate that long-range flight was impossible. The first British jet engines were notoriously temperamental, short-lived, and inefficient. Finch had been working on a radical concept, a mixed-flow turbojet that used an unconventional compressor and turbine blade designed to achieve unprecedented fuel efficiency at high altitudes. The engine, codenamed the Finch Eye, or the Wasp, by the mechanics who feared its unpredictable sting, was a beast of polished steel and terrifying heat. It was massive, requiring two to be slung beneath the slender wing. When they were finally run in the quarry test cell, the noise was not the throaty roar of a Merlin or the deep bass thrum of a radial. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek, the sound of 1944 dragged back into 1940. It was a sound that, once heard, marked the listener as an initiate of the secret. The combined imperatives, Thorne's aerodynamics, Vance's metallurgy, Hemlock's structure, and Finch's propulsion, demanded not just innovation, but a quantum leap. The engineers weren't solving problems. They were inventing solutions from whole cloth, building an aircraft that, on paper, should have required the technological infrastructure of the post-war world. Meanwhile, the war continued its bloody, inevitable pace. While Project Chimera lay hidden in Little Marston, the first of the great strategic bombers, the Avro Lancaster, was entering service. The Lancaster was a masterpiece of wartime necessity, robust, capable of handling enormous bomb loads, and relatively easy to mass produce. It would become the hammer of Bomber Command, the symbol of Britain's resolve. Yet, to the Red Pass holders of Project Chimera, the Lancaster was already obsolete. In his Spartan office, Air Vice Marshal Calthorpe kept a grim chart. One column tracked the sorties flown by the new Lancasters, another tracked the losses. A third column, marked simply C, tracked the projected performance gains of the Chimera. The Lancaster flew at 20,000 feet, where the flak was thickest and the Messerschmitts stalked. The Chimera was designed for 40,000 feet, the thin air, where the enemy fighters struggled to maneuver, their engines choked for oxygen, and the flak bursts were impotent, blossoming harmlessly miles below like metallic flowers. The Lancaster required 6 or 7 brave men, all trained in the frantic, close-quarters combat of a night raid. The Chimera would require only 2, a pilot, trained for high-speed, high-altitude precision, and a navigator bombardier, insulated from the chaos below and focused solely on the pinpoint accuracy required to justify the massive cost of the aircraft. The contrast highlighted the cruel necessity of the secret project. Every Lancaster loss, every missing airman, underscored the urgency of Chimera. The public needed the Lancaster, a machine they could understand, built by companies they knew. The war needed Project Chimera, a ghost in the machine, a silent threat that could not be countered because its existence was technologically unthinkable. The engineers toiled under this enormous shadow of responsibility. Every delay, every failed test of the revolutionary metal, felt like a personal betrayal of the boys freezing in the cockpits of the Lancasters. "We are asking men to fight this war with swords," Thorne would whisper to Vance, staring at his complex aerodynamic diagrams. "We are building a weapon that will use the language of the future. We just have to ensure the future arrives before the swords break." The construction of the first prototype, designated Chimera X1 by the team, was an agonizing process, less like manufacturing and more like delicate watchmaking. The metal alloy, a creation of Dr. Vance's tireless work, was the most difficult material they had ever encountered. Magnesium lithium was incredibly light, but prone to catastrophic stress fractures if mishandled. It had to be worked at precise temperatures, molded using entirely new tools, and chemically bonded in dust-free chambers. A single hammer strike, a moment of impatience, could ruin an entire fuselage section. The assembly hangar was kept at a constant, low temperature to manage the metal's volatility. The Blue Pass engineers, still believing they were building a weather plane, worked with the meticulousness of jewelers, slowly piecing together the impossible airframe. The first major milestone was the fusion of power. Bringing Professor Finch's WASP engines from the quarry to Little Marston was a covert operation of staggering complexity. They were transported on low-loader trucks, wrapped in canvas and disguised as agricultural machinery, complete with fabricated mud and farm equipment logos. The journey was timed for the darkest, foggiest hours, escorted by plainclothes military police. The installation was a tense, 24-hour marathon. The jets were to be mounted in pods slung low beneath the wing, a design dictated by the high-velocity air intake requirements. Finch had designed the intake to be non-obvious, a smooth, continuous line on the leading edge of the pod that sucked air in almost invisibly, helping to maintain the laminar flow over the wing. When the two WASP engines were finally bolted onto the slender wings of the X-1, the silver, needle-like fuselage now resting on its tricycle landing gear, the true scale of the aircraft became apparent. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. It had no turrets, no visible antennae, all were flush-mounted, and its surfaces were flawless, reflecting the bare overhead bulbs like a polished mirror. It looked less like an RAF bomber and more like a silver shark that had somehow been taught to fly. Hemlock, the configuration lead, stared at the finished fuselage in awe, running a hand over the cold, smooth metal. "She doesn't look like she belongs to this war," he murmured. Dr. Thorne, standing beside him, simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the long, high-aspect wings. "She doesn't," he replied. "She belongs to the silence above it." The silence, however, was about to be broken. The next phase was taxiing, and then, the moment of truth that Calthorpe, Thorne, and the handful of others had risked their careers, their freedom, and perhaps their lives for first flight. If the Chimera X-1 worked, it changed the war. If it failed, the secret would likely be buried with the wreckage, and the gamble would have been for nothing. The fate of the strategic bombing campaign, and perhaps the morale of a nation, was about to ride on a machine that the laws of 1940 aeronautics insisted could not exist. The two men selected to crew the Chimera X-1 for its maiden flight and subsequent test program were not chosen for their operational heroism, but for a cold, almost clinical skill set, their ability to remain calm in the face of absolute mechanical terror, and their deep mathematical understanding of flight at the edge of the known envelope. The pilot was squadron leader Alistair "Ace" Cameron. Cameron was not the flashiest fighter ace. His wartime record was solid, not spectacular, but his real value lay in his pre-war background as an experimental test pilot for gliders and high-performance civilian racers. He had an innate, almost symbiotic sense of an airframe's limit. Crucially, Cameron possessed a rare, profound patience. He could coax an unstable design into compliance, prioritizing data acquisition over adrenaline. He saw his mission not as fighting the enemy, but fighting the deficiencies in the machine. He was also a widower, a fact Calthorpe noted chillingly in his file, a man less tethered to the world of conventional expectation. His co-pilot and navigator, a position that combined the roles of bomb ame, engineer, and radio operator, was Flight Lieutenant Elena L. Petrova. A Russian émigré who had fled the purges of the late 1930s, Petrova had a degree in celestial mechanics and was the only person outside of Thorne's team who could fully grasp the complexities of the specialized, high-altitude navigation system designed for the Chimera. The sheer speed of the aircraft meant that traditional dead reckoning was useless. They needed precise star sighting and constant, minute-by-minute atmospheric correction. Petrova's ice-cool temperament and her ability to perform complex calculations under pressure made her indispensable. In the tiny, claustrophobic pressurized cockpit, a technological marvel that itself required a separate engineering team, Cameron and Petrova would be sealed off from the world, their survival dependent solely on their mutual skill and trust. They were subjected to 6 weeks of brutal, isolated training at a remote physiological research unit, practicing emergency procedures for decompression at 40,000 feet, learning to breathe the thin, bottled oxygen, and rehearsing the dizzying complexity of the Finch I-jet engines, which had more dials and pressure gauges than a destroyer's boiler room. "The machine is unforgiving," squadron leader Thorne warned Cameron during their final briefing in the Nissan HUD office. "If the jet engine fails, you have 10 seconds to initiate the cross-feed and relight sequence, or you become a very fast glider. At that height, there is no second chance. The air is too thin to wait for miracles." Cameron merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the crude diagrams of the Wasp's fuel system. "We'll teach it to be forgiving, Doctor." The first flight attempt was scheduled for a Monday in late 1941. The day was chosen for the stability of the high-altitude weather forecast and the predicted heavy morning fog that would keep Little Marston's secret securely bottled in the valley until the aircraft was far above the clouds. At 03:00 hours, the Chimera X-1 was winched slowly out of its hangar. The process itself was nerve-wracking. The aircraft was so long, nearly 70 feet from nose to tail, and its wingspan so vast, that maneuvering it required a score of engineers and several carefully positioned tractors. In the dim, blue-green light cast by the filtered lamps, the aircraft shimmered. It was an ethereal, almost spectral thing. The engineers, dressed in heavy coats, huddled around Dr. Thorne and Professor Finch, their breaths clouding the cold air. The tension was palpable, a thick, almost metallic taste in the mouth. This was not the test of a new gun turret or a minor aerodynamic fix, this was the culmination of a political and engineering coup. Cameron and Petrova climbed the narrow ladder and squeezed into the cockpit. The pressurized cabin was so small it demanded intimacy. Petrova's navigation board overlapped Cameron's control yoke. They sealed the massive, reinforced canopy hatch, a final, definitive sound that cut them off from the world. The cabin's interior lights cast a pale green glow over the labyrinth of instruments, altitude gauges calibrated far higher than any current aircraft, machmeters then a rarity, and the terrifyingly complex engine management panel. Pressure holding at 14 psi, ace, Petrova's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ready for ignition sequence, Professor." Thorne, standing at the edge of the narrow, grassy runway, less a runway and more an extended sheep pasture, held a heavy field telephone to his ear. He cleared his throat. "Permission granted, squadron leader. Use maximum run." Cameron acknowledged with a terse, "Roger," then drew a deep breath. The silence of the valley was broken by a mechanical whine, the high-pitched starter motors engaging the Wasp engines. The whine escalated, climbing the scale, until it reached a screaming pitch that seemed to vibrate the very ground underfoot. Then came the ignition. A gout of orange-blue flame spat from the back of the engine pods, momentarily illuminating the fog. The metallic shriek began, not a roar, but a tearing sound, the sound of air being violently ripped apart. The noise was deafening, a sound so utterly alien to the valley that the startled local livestock screamed in protest from the surrounding fields. The Chimera X-1 began to roll, slowly at first, gathering speed with an unnatural, relentless acceleration. The landing gear of the prototype was simple and robust, but the vibration caused by the nascent jets was already immense. "We have critical vibration in the port nacelle, engineer," Cameron reported calmly. Finch, standing beside Thorne, held his breath. "Normal for high spool up. Continue." The X-1 hurtled down the grass strip. The engineers watched, their eyes straining through the fog, seeing only a silver blur. The speed was incredible. It surpassed the lift-off speed of a Lancaster in half the distance. Then, disaster almost struck. One of the nose wheel brakes, slightly dragging, heated the alloy rim beyond its limit. The magnesium-lithium structure, stressed to the maximum by the speed and vibration, protested with a sharp, sickening sound of tearing metal. Cameron felt the whole airframe yaw violently to the right. Petrova, without a word, slammed her hand onto the engine control panel, momentarily throttling back the starboard engine just enough to counteract the asymmetrical drag. The aircraft corrected itself, staggering back onto the centerline. Tearing noise, right side. Assume gear failure, Cameron reported, his voice devoid of emotion. We must commit. He jammed the throttles forward. The Wasp engines screamed again, the air intake sucking in the morning fog and accelerating the mass of air to impossible speeds. At the very last usable meter of the field, the nose lifted. The long, slender wing, the slender dagger, found its purchase in the dense, cold air. The Chimera X-1 did not heave itself into the air like a conventional bomber. It sliced off the ground with a terrifying, effortless acceleration, becoming instantly lighter due to the fuel it had already consumed. The noise quickly receded, swallowed by the rising air and the fog. Within 60 seconds of liftoff, the shimmering silver projectile was gone, swallowed by the cloud deck. On the ground, Thorne and Finch stared at the empty, dew-soaked grass. She flies, Thorne whispered, his voice hoarse. But she is a beast, Finch. A beautiful, dangerous beast. The real test. The battle against the thin air, the cold, and the immense structural stresses of the upper atmosphere, had just begun. The Chimera X-1 climbed with an audacity no aircraft of its time could match. At 25,000 feet, where the last of the Halifax bombers struggled through icing conditions, the X-1 was slicing through the air like a knife through silk. The world below became an enormous, boiling mass of white cloud. The goal was 40,000 feet. The journey from 30,000 to 40,000 feet was a lesson in the harsh physics of the stratosphere, the region that Thorne had dubbed high-altitude hell. Outside air temperature is -65 Celsius, ACE, Petrova reported, her breath condensing on the faceplate of her heavy, custom-designed oxygen mask. The internal heating system, designed by Hemlock, was already struggling against the extreme external cold, and frost was beginning to creep across the edges of the cockpit canopy. The flight controls, designed using a complex set of hydraulic actuators, were proving difficult. In the dense air below, the small control surfaces had been sufficient. Up here, where the air pressure was less than a fifth of sea level, the controls became spongy, almost unresponsive. Cameron had to manhandle the yoke, using massive control throws to achieve the slightest adjustment. Lateral response sluggish, like steering a cathedral, Cameron observed. We're going to need massive trim adjustments just to hold a straight line. More concerning was the engine response. Professor Finch's Wasp jets, while efficient for the era, were thirsty consumers of oxygen. As the air thinned, the jets began to surge and protest. At 35,000 feet, the port engine, starved of sufficient air density, began to cough, a heavy, rhythmic shudder that shook the entire airframe. The EGT exhaust gas temperature gauges spiked instantly. Port EGT climbing rapidly. Fuel flow irregular, Petrova shouted, already initiating the emergency cross-feed. This was the moment of truth that Thorne had feared. If the engine flamed out now, the long-winged Chimera would enter a terrifying dive. Its streamlined design, meant for minimum drag, would turn it into a supersonic arrowhead pointed straight at the ground, likely tearing itself apart before the pilots could re-engage the engine at a lower, denser altitude. Cameron, remembering the hours of simulator practice, acted instantly, performing a move entirely contrary to piston engine instincts. He increased the speed. By pushing the nose down slightly and gaining speed, he forced more air through the struggling intake, ramming it into the compressor. The combined effort, Petrova adjusting the fuel mixture while Cameron played a delicate game of angle versus speed, stabilized the Wasp. The coughing ceased. The EGT settled back into the green zone. They had flirted with disaster, but they had solved the problem with raw skill and an intimate knowledge of the jet's strange new demands. At 40,500 feet, they leveled off. The view was breathtaking. The sky above was not the deep blue of the lower atmosphere, but a dark, perpetual sapphire, the edge of space. The world below was an immense, undulating blanket of white cloud, a map of silence that stretched to the distant horizon. 40,500 feet, Professor, Cameron radioed back, his voice thick with cold and fatigue. The flak and the Messerschmitts are somewhere down there. The crew spent a tense 15 minutes at altitude, meticulously recording data on control feel, engine performance, and cabin pressurization, data that was worth more than 1,000 Lancasters. Then, the inevitable command came: return to Little Marston. The landing was almost as terrifying as the initial structural failure on takeoff. The Chimera, so graceful at speed, became heavy and wallowy in the dense air of the approach. Cameron brought the nose up too quickly on final, and the laminar flow, so vital to Thorne's design, separated violently. The whole aircraft shuddered, threatening a catastrophic stall. Only Cameron's masterful use of the trim and a burst of power from the Wasp jets saved the landing. The tricycle gear hit the grass with a heavy bump, the alloy wheels screaming a protest. As the X-1 rolled to a stop, the engineers rushed the aircraft, not to celebrate, but to examine the structural scars left by the flight. The report to Calthorpe was simple: the Chimera flies. But it is not a bomber yet. It is a research instrument of incredible power and equally incredible frailty. The true work of refining the prototype was just beginning. The test flights that followed were a grueling, 18-month cycle of failure, redesign, and agonizing progress. The initial structural instability confirmed Hemlock's and Vance's greatest fears. The magnesium-lithium alloy, while light, was unforgiving under dynamic load. The wing warp crisis. The most dangerous problem involved the wings. The immense span and thinness, necessary for high-altitude efficiency, meant that at high subsonic speeds, approaching the 380 miles per hour cruise, the wingtips began to flutter, an aerodynamic phenomenon known as aeroelastic divergence. This was a structural death sentence. If the flutter became self-sustaining, the wings would simply tear themselves off the fuselage. Dr. Vance and Mr. Hemlock spent weeks locked in the damp hangar, covering sections of the X-1 with small, black tufts of wool, observing the airflow in controlled, low-speed flights. They determined the flexing was caused by a combination of the material's elasticity and the internal slosh of the fuel in the wet wing. The solution was not to strengthen the wing with heavier metal, that would compromise the speed and altitude, but to redistribute the weight and change the internal structure. Hemlock introduced a series of carefully calculated torsion stiffeners deep within the fuel cells, essentially creating a second, invisible honeycomb structure within the wing spar. This added minor weight but dramatically increased the wing's resistance to twisting. The effect was immediate. The deadly high-speed flutter was eliminated, but the engineers were haunted by how close they had come to losing the entire project to an invisible ripple in the air. The pressurization nightmare. The cockpit, sealed against the near vacuum of 40,000 feet, became a constant source of trouble. The system, designed to maintain a survivable cabin altitude of 10,000 feet, was prone to terrifying leaks. Even a pinhole failure could lead to catastrophic explosive decompression, a sudden, violent drop in pressure that would instantly incapacitate the crew. Petrova, who was living in a small, isolated cottage near Little Marston, dedicated her off hours to studying the behavior of seals and valves at extreme low temperatures. She discovered that the rubberized seals, while working perfectly on the ground, became brittle and contracted in the extreme cold of the stratosphere. Her solution was a clever system of redundant, layered seals made from a mixture of synthetic polymers and a newly developed, temperature-resistant resin. The cockpit was made airtight by a double-skin design, with a low-pressure buffer zone between the two skins to isolate any minor breach. The navigator's eye, perhaps the most critical innovation, concerned the guidance system. A bomber designed for precision bombing at night from the edge of the atmosphere required a level of accuracy that was impossible with existing Norden-style bombsights. Thorne, working with Petrova, developed the Astro-Inertial Navigator AIN. It was a massive, delicate machine, a combination of a celestial telescope, a powerful gyroscope, and an electromechanical computer that could continuously track the aircraft's position relative to specific stars, even in daylight. The pilot's cockpit had a unique, small window protected by a quartz pane that allowed Petrova to take continuous star shots. The AIN's calculations were fed directly into the bomb aiming system, compensating for wind, speed, and the bomb's immense drop time from 40,000 feet. It was a pre-digital computer built of brass, clockwork, and vacuum tubes, a fragile but revolutionary instrument. The crew no longer flew an airplane, they flew a laboratory for the delivery of destruction, dependent on the silent, rhythmic pulse of the AIN. By the middle of 1942, the Chimera X-1 was no longer just a prototype. It was a refined weapon. It could reliably hit 41,000 feet, cruise at 390 miles per hour, and maintain course stability. It was ready for the next, terrifying stage, weapons integration. The Chimera was designed to carry a reduced payload compared to a Lancaster, but its mission profile demanded a bomb of disproportionate destructive power. The sheer cost and risk of the aircraft meant that its target selection would be limited to only the most vital, hardened industrial or political complexes deep within Germany. One bomb had to do the job of dozens. The solution was the thin-skinned payload, codenamed Ironclad. While conventional bombs had thick casings to survive low-altitude drops and impacts, the Ironclad was different. Since it would be released from the relative vacuum of the stratosphere, Thorn and the munitions experts realized they could drastically reduce the thickness of the steel casing. This allowed them to pack a far greater amount of high-explosive, a newly formulated, more potent RDX-based compound into the same volume. The Ironclad was an exercise in pure destructive efficiency, a lightweight, heavy-impact casing packed with the maximum possible explosive charge. The 6,000 pounds requirement for the Chimera was, in terms of explosive potential, equivalent to nearly 10,000 pounds of conventional ordnance. The process of loading and release was itself a test of the Chimera's radical design. The bomb bay was not a set of hinged doors but a complex, internal cradle that dropped the bomb only a few feet before retracting and sealing instantly, a requirement dictated by Thorn's obsession with maintaining the smooth, laminar airflow over the fuselage. If the bomb release mechanism failed, the consequences were unthinkable. The bomb would either be ripped away violently, damaging the airframe, or it would hang up, turning the ultra-light Chimera into a flying time bomb. The test drops were conducted in the lonely expanse over the Hebrides. From 40,000 feet, the Ironclad took nearly 45 seconds to reach the water. The drop required complex geometric calculations from Petrova and flawless timing from Cameron. The first successful drop, a huge plume of water erupting from the North Atlantic, was met not with cheers, but with a collective sigh of relief. The weapon system worked. The Chimera X-1 was officially operational. As the Chimera X-1 stood ready for combat deployment in late 1942, Air Vice Marshal Calthorpe faced his toughest enemy yet, the War Cabinet and the RAF High Command. The operational successes of the Lancaster were now undeniable. Under the ruthless efficiency of Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Command was finally inflicting massive, verifiable damage on German cities and industry. The losses remained horrific, but the strategic necessity was accepted. The establishment saw the Lancaster and the Halifax as the answer. Calthorpe and Thorn's request, to divert a huge amount of resources, specialized fuel, and the two irreplaceable crew members to a new, unproven jet bomber, was met with intense suspicion and hostility. You propose flying a 6,000-pound bomb, piloted by two people, halfway across Germany, using an engine that screams like 1,000 devils, relying on an untested navigation machine, while we have 500 perfectly good Lancasters available, demanded the Chief of Air Staff, Air Marshal Sir Geoffrey Trent, during a classified briefing in the crypt. Sir, we propose flying over the enemy, Calthorpe retorted, spreading out a new chart. The current loss rate for a deep penetration raid is 4.5%. That means, statistically, we lose 45 crews for every 1,000 that fly. This machine, if successful, offers a 0% predicted loss rate because nothing can touch it. Trent sneered. Predicted. This is an academic experiment, Calthorpe. Bomber Command is a meat grinder, not a laboratory. Where is your mass production plan? There is no mass production plan yet, Thorn interrupted, standing beside Calthorpe. This is a strategic scalpel, not a hammer. Its value is not in the amount of bombs it drops, but in the irrefutability of its presence. When the Germans realize we can hit Berlin's main power station at noon, untouched, they must divert entire fighter divisions and flak batteries to guard the stratosphere. We change their entire defensive deployment with 2 people and 1 bomb. This was the core strategic genius of Project Chimera, psychological dislocation. The Chimera was not meant to win the war by itself. It was meant to shatter the enemy's confidence in their defensive perimeter, forcing them to waste resources chasing a shadow. After a tense, 2-hour debate that required the intervention of the Prime Minister's representative, Calthorpe was granted a single, non-negotiable operational window, 3 missions, code-named Operation Nightingale. If any one of the 3 missions failed, if the Chimera was shot down, damage beyond immediate repair, or if the mission failed to hit its target, Project Chimera would be immediately terminated, all personnel dispersed, and the blueprints burned. The pressure was now absolute. Cameron and Petrova were not just test pilots, they were carrying the entire future of the project on their shoulders. To support Operation Nightingale, a micro-unit was formed, the Phantom Development Flight PDF. It consisted only of Cameron, Petrova, Thorne as mission analyst, Finch as engine tech, and 6 hand-picked mechanics sworn to secrecy. Their training transitioned from flight stability to operational realism. They established a new, ultra-clandestine base, a temporary airfield carved out of an abandoned estate in East Anglia, closer to the North Sea launch point. The runway was short, disguised by netting during the day, and illuminated only by vehicle headlights on takeoff and landing. The focus shifted entirely to the mission profile. The ascent. Maximum rate of climb to 41,000 feet immediately after takeoff to avoid the low-altitude German Ju-88 night fighters. The penetration. Maintaining absolute radio silence and course precision for the 2,000-mile flight deep into German airspace. The drop. The 45-second precision bombing run, managed entirely by Petrova using the AIN. Egress. A 180-degree turn at speed and a flawless return home, relying solely on the velocity advantage. The Chimera X-1 was painted a matte, heat-dissipating black on its underside and polished silver on top, a compromise intended to make it invisible against the night sky from below, yet reflective against the dark blue of space from above. The pilots rehearsed the critical emergency procedures, especially the twin-engine flameout at altitude, hundreds of times in a claustrophobic simulator. The stakes were no longer theoretical. Their lives, and the success of the entire strategic shift, now rested on their mastery of the impossible. The ironclad bomb was loaded into the X-1's sleek belly on a cold December night in 1942. The target for Operation Nightingale 1 was not a city, but the Dora V2 rocket assembly plant in northern Germany, a target so heavily fortified and so vital to the German war machine that no conventional bomber raid had ever come close to it. The plan was audacious. Fly straight over the top of the Kammhuber line, hit the target in the early morning light, and be back over the North Sea before the German high command even understood what had hit them. On the night before the mission, Calthorpe met Cameron and Petrova in the briefing room, a converted stable. There was no fanfare, no grand speech. Squadron leader, Flight Lieutenant, Calthorpe said, his voice quiet. "You are carrying more than a bomb. You are carrying the most dangerous secret the Allies possess. Your success will save thousands of young men in the years to come. Your failure will bury this project forever." Cameron simply nodded. Petrova checked the calibration of her AIN maps one last time. In the silence of the barn, under the weight of the war, the two individuals who held the future of Project Chimera seemed utterly, terrifyingly alone. The stage was set for the Shadow Bomber's debut. At 0100 hours, December 14, 1942, the two-person crew of the Chimera X-1 strapped themselves in. The cockpit was cold, smelling faintly of pressurized oxygen and new metal. The field lights, a row of dimmed vehicle lamps, flickered in the mist. The two Wasp engines spooled up. The noise, that high, tearing shriek, was muffled only slightly by the distance and the fog. Cameron held the brakes until the gauges read maximum thrust, a point where the entire airframe vibrated violently. Release. The Chimera shot forward, its acceleration unlike anything the mechanics had ever witnessed. It was not a takeoff, it was a catapult launch. The long, narrow wings immediately found purchase, and the X-1 was airborne in seconds, climbing at a brutal, continuous angle designed to put the maximum distance between them and the hostile lower air. Altitude 15,000 feet. Climb rate nominal, Petrova reported. Below them, the English coast dissolved into darkness. Ahead, the Channel and the enemy. The climb was relentless. At 35,000 feet, they could feel the difference in the air. The controls stiffened, the light outside dimmed, and the Wasp jets required constant, gentle nursing from Cameron to prevent thermal spikes and flameouts. At 41,500 feet, they leveled off, settling into their optimal cruise speed of 395 miles per hour. The sun had not yet risen for the world below, but up here, the sky was a deep, velvet black pricked with impossibly bright stars. They were in the zone of inviolability. The flight across German airspace was a ghostly, silent affair. Below them, they could occasionally see the angry, frantic pinpricks of light that marked the battles of the conventional bomber command stream, the distant red flares of a target marker, the sudden blossom of a flak burst, the searching beams of anti-aircraft searchlights. The Messerschmitts, flying 15,000 feet below, were dots of reflected moonlight, utterly incapable of reaching the Chimera's height. They were flying faster than any German fighter in level flight, higher than any flak gun could aim, and doing so with the eerie, tearing sound of the jets, a sound that, at this altitude, was quickly dissipated by the thin air, rendering them effectively silent to the ground. Petrova was the key to their survival. She had the aim locked onto 3 pre-selected stars, making micro-adjustments to the course. Her primary task now was navigation, but her secondary, psychological role was to constantly reassure Cameron that the aircraft was doing exactly what it was designed to do, making the laws of war redundant. Passing Frankfurt, ace, on schedule, no fighter activity on radar, she murmured, scanning the primitive, high-frequency radar display. The air was bitterly cold, even inside the pressurized cabin, but the atmosphere was calm. There was no frantic weaving, no shouting, no machine gun fire, just the steady, unnerving shriek of the Wasp engines and the rhythmic click of Petrova's chronometer. As dawn began to paint the eastern horizon a pale, metallic gold, they approached the target area, the Dora V2 assembly plant, nestled deep within a valley, heavily guarded by concentric rings of flak batteries and fighter aerodromes. Cameron eased the Chimera into a gentle, 5-degree dive, increasing their speed to over 400 miles per hour. This maneuver was crucial. The momentum gained would allow the ironclad to maintain maximum velocity and stability on its long fall, while giving the aircraft the maximum possible margin of escape. Target acquisition confirmed. Ace, Petrova reported, her voice now sharp with concentration. Aim is locked. Initial velocity, 410 miles per hour. Target vectoring in 5, 4. Petrova's eye was pressed against the specialized optical sight. She was looking at a factory the size of a small town, preparing to drop a bomb on a single hangar door from over 7 miles up. 3, 2, 1. Bombs gone. The release was a violent shudder. The internal cradle mechanism slammed the 6,000 pounds ironclad out into the slipstream and instantly snapped shut. The aircraft gave a sudden, brief lurch of relief at the loss of the massive weight. Cameron immediately threw the X-1 into a tight, high-G turn, a turn designed not to avoid pursuit, but to quickly dislocate the aircraft from the bomb's trajectory and maximize the distance from the imminent explosion. The bomb's fall was a silent spectacle of physics. It plummeted for a full 45 seconds, accelerating until it was traveling faster than sound in the denser air below. The guards on the ground, alerted only seconds before by the brief, receding shriek of the Chimera's turn, looked up to see nothing. The ironclad hit the reinforced roof of the main V2 assembly hall, punching through the concrete like a molten needle. The force of the detonation, the maximized RDX charge delivered by the thin-skinned casing, was catastrophic. The ground was briefly lit by an unnatural, violent white light. The explosion did not just destroy the building, it vaporized it. The resulting shockwave, funneled up the valley, was powerful enough to temporarily blind the pilots of the flak batteries 10 miles away. From 41,000 feet, Cameron and Petrova felt only a distant, muffled thump, like a book dropping on a thick carpet, and saw a sudden, enormous plume of black, greasy smoke rising rapidly through the cloud layers. Target destroyed. Mission objective successful, Petrova stated, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of what they had just witnessed. Cameron straightened the aircraft. Time to go home, L. They turned west and began the long, silent journey back across the continent, flying high above the cloud cover that was now scrambling desperately for fighters to intercept a ghost. The German air defense system had been breached, circumvented, and rendered irrelevant by 2 people in a machine built from an impossible dream. Operation Nightingale I was a success, and the war, though the world didn't know it yet, was about to change.